Let's start with an extremely interesting story from Viper 30000. Turnabout is always fair play. I'm not sure if this one belongs here, as I was not the one actually wronged. My revenge was taken for someone I have never met, and I honestly don't know if they personally got any satisfaction from it. I do know what it did to the perpetrator, and that it satisfied me, so I'll let the readers decide. Like many of my tales, this one takes place in the distant past, before cell phones were common and before universal caller ID was the norm, in a time dinosaur most likely roamed the earth. Well, the 80s at least. These things are very important to this story. Our tale takes place in a large West Coast city known for a big orange bridge and delicious sourdough bread. I was living in the city for several months, working temporary duty for my company, and was preparing for work on the day in question. As was my custom, I was getting dressed listening to the morning radio show on a local station. This station's jocks had started doing something called the Monday morning wake-up call, where, on the first day of the week, they would make a prank call on the air to a victim chosen from write-in suggestions from the listening audience. Doing this was actually very controversial in radio circles at the time. I had been a radio DJ in my hometown for a few years, and there are rules you must follow. One of the biggest rules is that you can't make a false or deceptive radio transmission, like announcing an emergency, sending an SOS or cry for help or other such deceptions. Doing so is a federal offence. You can lose your license and be fined, or even do jail time. It's a big no-no. The debate has long since been decided, but at the time doing prank calls on the air was a grey area. There were people who were sure it constituted a false transmission, and some stations refused to do it. The argument was still alive at the time this happened. This day happened to be Monday, and the intended victim had been nominated by her husband. They had experienced a power failure at home earlier in the week, and the husband's suggestion was that the station call his wife, claimed to be from the utility, and tell her that the power outage was somehow their fault and they would have to pay for it. The station staff loved the idea, and they proceeded to call the wife at her place of employment, a local bank. The victim answered and the prank began. "Hello, is this Mrs. Victim? I'm John Doe from Area Power Company. Do you remember having a power failure earlier this week? Well, it was due to a blown transformer on your block, and we've determined that the cause is a wiring fault in your house. We may have to cut off your power until you get it fixed. Also, you will be charged for the transformer. The total cost is X thousand dollars. Would you prefer we put that on your utility bill, or do you want to make other arrangements to pay?" As you might imagine, the woman was shocked, then scared. As she asked for more information, having trouble believing that they were going to have to pay thousands of dollars, she got increasingly more upset. This egged the radio staff on. The guy making the call kept increasing the pressure on her more and more, eventually telling her that her power would likely be cut off until payment was made, and that there might be a lawsuit. After several minutes, she suddenly hung up in tears. He called her back, and when she heard his voice, she hung up again, crying even harder. This time, the guy waited a minute, and then called back again. Another lady answered the phone, a co-worker, and he asked to speak to Mrs. Victim. When the co-worker asked his name, he replied, "This is her husband, distinctive first name." The co-worker cursed at him, called him a liar, and hung up. The radio studio was filled with laughter. The jocks thought it was hilarious. They took calls from listeners who were all laughing and talking about what a great prank it was. They finally got the husband on the phone, he of the distinctive name, and he was also laughing and joking that he'd surely be sleeping on the sofa tonight. He was congratulating the radio staff on the fine job they had done terrorizing his wife. The radio hosts promised the listening audience that, because the prank was so funny, they would certainly be playing the whole recorded prank again at noon, so be sure to be listening and call your friends. I, in my efficiency apartment listening to this, was getting mad. I was still pretty newly married and couldn't imagine doing something like that to my wife. All I could think of, while the staff and listeners on the radio were laughing, was that, a few miles away, A young woman was in the ladies' room crying, probably with co-workers trying to calm her down. What made it worse to my mind was that the guy who set her up for this was the one guy in the world who should have her back, her husband. Anger turned to resolve. Resolve formed a plan. I grabbed the city phone book, remember, it's the 80s, and looked up 2 phone numbers. I called the first one. You may remember that I said I had been a radio disc jockey myself. It was a tiny, dawn to dusk station, but I knew how stations worked. I knew what they liked, and more to the point, I knew what they did not like. I also had done a lot of voiceover work and could sound professional as heck. The phone rang and was answered. "You've reached K, Radio Jerk." I launched my attack. Me, professional voice. "Yes, this is George Smith." I picked a more believable name from the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. "I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it." Radio Guy 1, stammering. "Oh, he's not, here right now. Let me get you someone else." I was put on hold. After a few moments, Radio Guy 2, also stammering. "Hi, hello. This is Radio Guy 2. You're from the FCC?" Me? "Yes, this is George Smith from the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. As I told your co-worker, I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it." Radio Guy 2, short silence. He's not in yet. He'll be here at, 9 o'clock. Me? "Okay, well, I can start with your station manager since he will need to be in the conversation as well." Radio Guy 2, breathing fast, starting to lose all his composure. "Oh, wow. He gets in at 9 too. I can I have him call you?" He half asked and half pleaded. Me, letting out what I hoped was a bureaucratic sounding sigh. "Very well. I will expect to hear from him at 9. I will need to speak to your station manager, your programming director, and very likely your on-air personnel from this morning. I'll also need your station logs." Radio Guy 2. "Oh, yes, sir. I'll make sure he calls you right away." Me. "All right, I'll be expecting his call. Here's my number." At this point, I gave Radio Guy 2 the second number I had looked up in the phone book, the main number for the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. Radio Guy 2 stammered his thanks and promises of phone calls, and we hung up. I went back to the radio. Jerk disc jockey. "Ah, the FCC is calling. Well, they can't do anything to me. I've got a year of pre-law in college and blah, blah, blah." He continued his defiance for a few minutes and then went to commercial. I kept listening. They stopped talking about the prank call. They stopped taking phone calls from listeners. They stopped talking to the husband. They started playing music. A lot of music. I listened for the rest of the day. They didn't talk about it the rest of that day, and they didn't replay it at noon. In fact, for the rest of the week, I listened and heard nothing about it. I was a bit surprised. I figured that they might stop talking about it for a little while, but not altogether. It wasn't until later that I realized why they went so silent. I had scared them. In my quest to get a little vengeance for that crying woman I'd never met, I scared them. But more to the point, I'd embarrassed them, and Jerk Disc Jockey had helped. Once he went live with his bravado against the call from the feds, their listeners knew they'd been called and heard the silence afterward too. They were embarrassed because I had just done to them what they had done to her, and they didn't want to have to admit it. I've kept the rather distinctive name of the husband a secret because I have always wished that I could meet that poor woman, and that name would be how I would know it was really her. I doubt she's still married to the guy, but I'd like to let her know that in that place, on that day, someone had her back. The revenge was clever and fitting. By pretending to be an FCC official, OP scared the radio station that had cruelly pranked a woman to tears. The threat of federal consequences silenced their bravado, forcing them to abandon their planned prank replay and avoid any further mention of it. The station, embarrassed and fearful, faced the same distress they had caused to the lady. For the victim of the prank, it was inspiredly help. The next story is from Lil Devil. How Mrs. Reliable got her douchebag of a boss fired. Hey everyone, long-time lurker on this subreddit, first-time posting, and boy do I have a story. So letting everyone know that it's going to be a long post, just letting everyone know ahead of time. Background. I've been working the retail business for over 20 years and let me tell you, some of the managers they hire, I can do a better job. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Over the years of doing retail, I have established a reputation for myself. I'm Mrs. Reliable. Need some to come in? They call me. Need someone to stay late? They call me. Need to switch with someone because management said no for your day off? They call me. Need to switch with someone because of a last-minute plans? They call me. You can probably see where this story might be going, right? This story takes place a couple of years ago when I worked a major grocery store in my town city as a cashier. The story. This has taken place a couple of years ago back in 2020. I'm on my 2 years at this store and we went through so many people and managers, it wasn't funny. Literally, it felt like we had a revolving door with how much turnover and employment we had. Getting back to the story, I was a cashier, and the thing about me doing this job is that I have a tendency to be too good at my job. I was just hired to be a cashier. I was not a manager nor a monitor, someone that is a step down from management, but doesn't have all the responsibilities of management, nor was a customer service. However, I was trained for nearly all the duties of someone who is. Need change? I went to cashier, got the money out of the drawer, and went to grab the change that they needed. Need an override? I came over, see what the problem is, and did the override. Need something from behind the counter? I just need to know what it is that you need, and I went and grabbed it. I did all this on top of my cashier duties and self-checkout duties. Then douchebag came along. My manager at the time, let's call her Ashley. Ashley is the front-end manager, meaning she's in charge of everything that goes on at the registers, cash office, where all the money is, customer service, and the self-checkouts. Now, I liked Ashley. She was a really good boss, and I liked working with her. Ashley had gotten pregnant and was expecting her second child. I was excited for her. Unfortunately, when Ashley came back though, she was no longer going to be a manager, nor was she going to full-time. She decided to come back as part-time. I can't really blame her though. You're working 40 hours a week and are not allowed any overtime whatsoever. Plus, you can be working as early as 5 a.m. to working as late as whenever the last customer decides to leave. Last time that happened when didn't get out until 11:15 p.m. Enter douchebag. If you ever wonder what happened to that spoiled brat in school whose mommy never said no and always got what they always wanted, that's douchebag all grown up in a manager's position. Douchebag was the type of manager that if he told you do something, he expected you to do it without any questions. Have plans after work? Douchebag expected you to whip out your phone right there and then, cancel your plans, and come into work. Have a doctor's appointment? Douchebag expected to cancel that appointment and then come into work. If you told him no, he would say in the most condescending tone, "Well, I need you to do anyway," and then just standing there scowling at you the whole time, basically trying to intimidate you by making you feel so uncomfortable by the staring until you cave. The setup. Now, I had my fair share of awful managers to the point where, if I didn't need the money, I would have walked right out right then and there and never returned. And I had my fair share of good managers. Douchebag was somewhere in the middle, leaning more towards the walking out. Now, with me, I'll admit, over the years, I developed a sassy, sarcastic personality. I'm blunt, no filter, say what's on mind, and I don't put up with people's bullshit. Apparently, douchebag never got the memo of my not taking people's bullshit. Around this time, summer was ending, meaning we were in the now hiring stage, and many positions were starting to open up in the store. Keep this in mind. What douchebag did to get me to start my pro-revenge? Strike one. I had out-of-patient vein surgery done one of my legs and needed to take a few days off. Since I had some vacation time saved up, I used my hours for those few days that I didn't have to worry so much about not getting paid. Douchebag called me a day before I was supposed to come in, asking if I can do a 9-1. I asked him 3 times over the phone, "Who's closing?" Because originally I was supposed to close that day until I got my approval for my days off. Douchebag never answered me, so I just figured they had it covered. I came in, and of course, halfway through my shift, douchebag calls me over and says that they don't have a closer. Keep in mind that I asked him 3 times over the phone who was closing. Douchebag wanted me to clock out, go home for a few hours, and then come to work and close. I said no, and then he tried the whole guilt tripping about not having anyone, and that we really need you to this. I said no because 1, I'm really tired and just came off surgery like 3 days ago. 2, I already made plans with my husband for the evening. Of course, douchebag didn't like this, because the next time I came to work, douchebag was just being petty and passive-aggressive with me. Basically, he will either pretend I wasn't there, ignored me, or the transaction that he was doing was taking longer than it should, and then chastise me in front of the customers for taking too long to get him. When I had my follow-up appointment with the vein doctor, douchebag asked me if I can come earlier. I told him no, I can't, because I have a doctor's appointment in the morning that day. Then he did his usual, "We'll need you to do it anyway," and started to doing that stare with me. Unfortunately for him, I'm used to this when came to Karen's and Kevin's trying to intimidate me because something didn't come right. I quickly shut that down by getting the other cashier's attentions when they need help with something, or quickly grabbed a customer's attention. When I came in after my appointment, douchebag with a smug grin very loudly in earshot of the bigwigs from corporate visiting that day. "Well, OP, looks like you noticed that I didn't call you in, because we didn't need you." I replied, "Good, because wasn't able to come in early anyway." Strike 2. Remember how I said that the store had openings? Well, turns out customer service needed some help, and the only way to get there was to ask your manager. So, I went to douchebag and asked about being at the customer service desk. With everything that I've already been doing, I was basically the front-end assistant manager without the pay and title. Douchebag said that he would get back to me, especially since I've been doing a great job. 2 to 3 weeks later, I'm seeing people that I trained or have started months after I did getting promoted to customer service desk while I stayed as a cashier with all the others' responsibilities piled on top. The customer service desk position would have easily been a 50-cent raise. The monitor position would have been a 75-cent raise. And of course, douchebag didn't want to pay more for doing the exact same thing that I was already doing. I was starting to get the message of, why pay for the cow when the milk is free? Strike 3. I was starting to look for another job at this point because I was getting sick and tired of how I was being treated, but I wanted to try and give this guy one last chance. So I found out that the seafood department in my store had an opening, and I even talked to the seafood department manager Debbie about me possibly being in her department. He was ecstatic to have and was willing to work around my college schedule. I had to talk to my manager douchebag in order to get the transfer going. I talked to douchebag and he started to come up with any and all kinds of excuses to not have me transfer. I quickly shot that down, and even the one where he tried to say that I can't because another co-worker was transferring. First time I've heard of this, but the co-worker said they had no problem with me going. So I thought that was that, right? Wrong. 3 to 4 weeks have passed, and I've been getting nowhere with the whole transferring to the other department. Even Debbie was wondering why it was taking so long for get to the seafood department and why management was dragging their feet with this. Turns out, douchebag blocked my transfer, and they wound up hiring a new employee to the seafood department. Douchebag thought that if there were no positions available, and he can just deny my transfer, that I have no choice but to stay. After an argument between the two of us about this, because I was calling him out on his bullshit, Douchebag said the magic words. Just do your job. Cue the malicious compliance. Just do my job? Okay. I was so glad that the wearing a mask was required. Otherwise, douchebag might have seen my evil smile when I agreed to just do my job. Need an override? Sorry, but I'm not management nor am I a monitor, so I can't do that. Let me go grab someone who can. Need change? Sorry, but I'm not management nor am I a monitor, so I can't do that. Let me go grab someone who can. Need something behind the customer service desk? Sorry, but I'm not trained nor am I customer service. Let me grab someone who can get that for you. Douchebag was at his wit's end and even tried to write up for something. I quickly shut that down when I started to recite what being a cashier entails and what my actual job of being a cashier is. And I told him that if he wants me to continue with all those responsibilities that he needs to promote me so I can do all those responsibilities. He quickly stepped back into being his passive-aggressive behavior that I quickly shut down. I eventually found another job with a better pay and better benefits and handed in my resignation of me leaving in 10 days. That douchebag tried to deny and say, "No, you have to give us 2 weeks' notice." I quickly shut that down with a response. You wouldn't be giving us a 2-week notice if you are going to fire us or lay us off or let go. Just a 2-minute warning. Cue the petty revenge. Now, you're probably wondering, what could I have possibly done for the petty revenge, right? Well, there was an old saying, never kill the golden goose. Well, readers, what do you think happens to a department that is solely dependable on one person whose reputation is Mrs. Reliable? Need me to come in on my day off? Sorry, I can't. I have plans. Need me to stay late? Sorry, I can't. I already made plans. Some called out? Sorry, I can't make it. I did this throughout my entire rest of my stay at that place. Douchebag couldn't do anything about either, and it was starting to get to him on what happens when you rely heavily on someone else, but treat them so badly that they actually decide to leave. Douchebag's performance, because I wasn't there to cover his ass, was starting to take a toll. He had to do so much now, of his own responsibilities, and there wasn't a thing he could do to me. He kept trying to be extra passive-aggressive with me, to which I just smiled and waved and said goodbye to everyone but him. Now, this wouldn't be a pro-revenge without the pro-revenge. After talking to a friend of mine about what happened when I worked there, he told me to report this to the district manager because that kind of behavior isn't good for the workplace. Cue the pro-revenge. I got the email address of the district manager from my friend, and then I went back to the store as a customer. I kept in touch with a couple of my old co-workers and kept asking them how they were doing and how's work going. None of them had a problem in venting to me on how bad things were getting with douchebag. I asked if they didn't mind if I put their name in the complaint or if they just wanted to be anonymous. A lot of them choose the latter. I whipped out my phone, used the quick memo app that I had, and quickly wrote the notes in my phone, the date and the register that the cashier was on at the time. I sent that email with the attached notes and with the entire account on my part as well to the district manager. Now, this wouldn't be a pro-revenge if it just stopped there. I took a step further. You see, with the receipts that we get, there is a survey on the bottom of every receipt, and management kept trying to boost us to get customers to take the survey because it helped with the story front and all the points that the store gets. Well, here's the thing about that survey. When you fill out the survey, including the comments, everyone gets to see it, and I mean everyone. Douchebag, the assistant store manager, the regional manager, the district manager, and the representative of Cooperate gets to see it all. So, you can imagine what I did. Needed a snack for school, filled out the survey, needed groceries, filled out the survey, needed a drink, filled out the survey. I went to that store multiple times and gotten so many different surveys because there wasn't a limit for how many you can fill out. And I made sure to put everything that douchebag was doing on all those surveys, including how he treated his employees. 3 months after I left, the person they hired back in seafood to make sure I couldn't go back there quit. 6 months after I left, douchebag was nowhere to found. A new manager took over for him and no one seems to know what happened to douchebag. TLDR. A new manager took over for my old one and was a complete and utter douchebag, treating myself and others horrible, and refused not only promote me, but refused to have me transferred to another department so that I continued doing my overworked and underpaid responsibilities of Mrs. Reliable. I turned around and got him fired. Edit. For those of you wondering, commenting, no, I did not stay in one place for the 20 years. I wouldn't stay working for some place only making minimum wage and no benefits. The retail business is really shading. The only raise I got was when minimum wage went up. But during the pandemic, we all started making 30 cents more an hour. But when the state reopened and they announced that we will be going back to minimum wage, more than half the staff left. The 20 years of experience is me working the retail industry with different jobs. And before anyone asks, yes, I have applied to management positions. I either get brushed off or they keep telling me because I don't have a degree, then I can't get the management position. Just wanted to clear that up. The revenge was truly brilliant. After years of being overworked and underappreciated, Mrs. Reliable, used malicious compliance by only doing the bare minimum of her job when her arrogant boss refused her transfer and promotion. She then filed a detailed complaint with the district manager and bombarded customer surveys exposing the boss's behaviour. This ultimately cost the boss his job and reputation. Karma hits hard. The next story is from Shell Loser 42. Stealing my GF's Wi-Fi strained, or ended, their relationship. Hi gang. First, last time I posted here, I made a doo-doo with my story, and comparing it with some of the other stories here, I can only agree in hindsight. I know it means nothing on the scale of Reddit, but I'm sorry about that mishap and wanted to fix my mistake. Then my GF reminded me of this story today. Backstory. After my girlfriend moved to her new apartment closer to both her sister and myself, she obviously wanted internet. Although she isn't fully tech-savvy, she does know her basics and thus explicitly asked the provider if she should be worried about admin kind of Wi-Fi protection. She was assured that it was all fully safe out of the box. No admin. In fact, just press a button to connect her laptop and her Wi-Fi network would be fully secured. The incident. So a few months or years later, my GF started to notice that her internet speed went down. This became very apparent while video chatting with some of her family members in Japan. Like I said, my GF knows her basics, so she knew that it didn't have to be the internet connection itself. It could also be her laptop. Or maybe the network cables had eroded due to age. She decided to cover as many options as possible before contacting her ISP support desk, so she asked me to help. I'm a geek, and I worked within the field of ICT for over 30 years now, mostly as systems administrator, but also as IT manager or co-manager, during which I'd still try to keep taps with my colleagues and even cover shifts if the need arose. So visiting my GF and getting to show of my L33T IT skills. It took me a moment, but I discovered the issue. Someone was leeching of her Wi-Fi. Technically, the ISP support staff were right. This wasn't a admin kind of thing anymore. It was completely randomized. Sort of. You see, on their routers, the Wi-Fi password was the same as the random SSID, aka network name. What the F? I was quite angry at both this incompetence as well as the blatant disrespect for my GF's privacy. Maybe a bit too much, but yeah. Sure, for some people this is only about getting internet. But what many people overlook is that such leeches also gain access to your private network. So basically, they could also access any public Windows or Mac shares you may have active, not to mention any other connected devices. Fortunately, my GF knew her basics, as I mentioned earlier, but I was still angry. The revenge! So I suggested something I had done earlier. Let's replace this POS router for a professional device. In specific, the same kind of Zeal router that I used at my home so that we could set up a secured VPN between ourselves and get some other nice feats as well, like a private VoIP connection. She agreed, so we bought her a new router together. We're talking professional gear here. These things cost about as much as a high-end smartphone, so obviously we were going to split the costs, considering that a mid-level could also have helped her out. Now, even though I consider her previous router a POS, I still have to admit that it did provide some very useful features, like a syslog service. It could also use USB storage, so I turned on Wi-Fi logging, plugged in a large USB memory stick, and then we waited for the new router to arrive. Then I got to work. First, I set up my GF with a nice hidden Wi-Fi network so that no one could easily find it. Next, we set up a much better security scheme, and then it was time to get even with the lowlifes. I set up a second Wi-Fi network, which was completely the same as the previous one, but this time I throttled it down a bit so that it couldn't usurp the full bandwidth. Then I added some specific DNS overrides. DNS is a service on the internet which translates names into IP addresses, which is what your computer needs to connect to something. You may care about reddit.com. All your PC cares about are the associated IP addresses. Thing is, this service can be easily overridden. And I had studied the logs, so I knew exactly which sites the lowlives visited the most. So from now on, going to banker.nl using this router would point your browser to a hardcore, not very legal gay porn website. Not very legal as in, the site didn't bother asking for consent first, but got you some close-up screenshots right away. Then it was time for bankb.nl. I redirected that one to a shady, hot scissors lesbian website. I also noticed that a certain web shop was sporadically used by the leeches, so I decided to redirect that one to a relationship counseling website. When you think your spouse is cheating on you, come to us. It was around that time when I noticed that my GF's router was using a more modern firmware than I had on my router. This one also provided web redirection services. Companies can use this to redirect specific websites based on their URL to a local or remote web page. So, say you don't want your staff to use social media, then you could just tell the router to redirect, say, facebook.com, to a local web page which explained the no social media allowed policy. Much to my delight, this service also supported a randomizer trigger. See, I still remembered a website from the early days of the internet. Something about a goat from Sweden, which was so horrible that it became a meme on its own. Seriously, a look at that picture could never be undone anymore. There's a reason I still remember the horror now, an easy 30 years later. So, I looked for and found a replacement, and then happily added that to a randomized redirection service. So every once in a while, the leeches would open their favorite website as, and no matter whatever kind of site they asked for, they'd always end up with something completely and utterly disgusting on their screen. Then we waited. I need to point out that my girlfriend did not fully agree with some of my actions, especially when she learned of the aftermath. But we never had an argument over this because she could also understand my POV. Don't mess with my GF. And she agrees that if you trespass, even in the digital world, then all bets are off and you lost your rights to a civil solution. Don't mess with a geek, McKay. The aftermath. One day, my GF got home from work and noticed a huge moving van outside. She gave it no further mind, but when she got to her front door, she noticed that her neighbour 2 doors over was moving out. She brought this up with her direct in between neighbour a few days later. And as it turns out, things completely exploded over there. The shouting and accusations could even be heard through the walls. Seems the pair got into huge arguments about their rather explicit choice of websites, and once the deed was done, there was no room left for any kind of reasoning. One of the two even accused the other for hacking the internet, because it was only after the first fallout that those goating pictures started to show up. As far we know, they broke up. For the record, I regret nothing. I did remove the SSID for obvious reasons and also reset the DNS and forwarding sections, and now things are back to normal. More importantly, my GF is still very happy with the router and the extra services to this very same day of writing. She's working her way up as a 3D artist, and the knowledge that all her work will be fully kept safe after she copies her projects onto my NAS is a deal breaker for her. Seriously, you guys. Always remember that when you use someone else's internet connection, this includes free services, then you're fully relying on their goodwill. Such services could be easily abused as well, either through pranking like I did, or worse. How about I redirect your bank requests to a fake login page so that I can store and/or abuse your data? Thanks for reading. Edit. Some points which people raised. This story didn't play out 30 years ago, at most 6. It was impossible for the couple to make an honest mistake. First, the Wi-Fi names, even default ones, would be far apart. ISP 151413, ISP 201413, ISP 251413, and so on. Also, unlimited plans aren't common here, so one way or the other, they'd have seen to be using zero data over the months this went on. Not to mention that their password would never have matched that of my GF's. Assuming, of course, they even had a subscription, or the same ISP. As for the DNS, not UDNs, no, they wouldn't get to see the URL of their bank showing a PRON website, but at best an IP address. As for me, not caring at all about the aftermath, how entitled or unreasonable do you have to be to start accusing someone for opening up a website, but then refusing to listen to further reason and instead start a major drama? If they had both opened the same website, like the online store, then it would be immediately clear as to what had happened. This also leads up to the honest mistake. If it were an honest mistake, then wouldn't one of them have called their ISP to try and prove their point of being not guilty? At the very least to complain about shoddy service? Instead, they tore each other a new one. Edit 2. OMG. This post blew up beyond my expectations, even to a point where I couldn't keep up with comments anymore. I forgot a request above. TL. DR. GF had issues with her internet speed. Should have been right according to ISP. I discovered Wi-Fi leeches, getting mad over that I decided to escalate. We bought GF a new router. I copied the old Wi-Fi network, but with changes. 2 sites used by the leeches now led to hardcore PR0N websites, the last to a counselling website, for when your relationship hits a cliff. Several days later, GF learned that some people were moving out on her apartment level. When asking her direct neighbour, it turned out that their direct neighbours had quite the fallout. And my stance is still the same. If you're leeching of someone else's internet connection, then the fallout is on you. I pranked them, hard, but still, I'm convinced others would have done a lot worse. Wow, the digital revenge, which hit hard the leeches. OPs throttling the network speed and redirecting the leech's most visited websites to explicit and disturbing content such as hardcore porn and shady sites was satisfying. It was really satisfying. The next story is evidently_apostate. I love you, bud, but I'm cutting your throat. I'm a millwright who specializes in rebuilding natural gas turbines. I run with a very top caliber crew where everyone has a role to fill. My role is overseeing anything that's lifted with a crane. My technical title is rigger. If a load falls, it's my fault. If someone gets hurt while I'm in control of a lift, it's my fault. If equipment is damaged while I'm in control of a lift, it's my fault. The incident in question happened about 2 years ago, but we'll need to go back a couple years farther to get the backstory. I was a fresh member of the crew and had demonstrated competency in rigging, so after roughly 6 months with this group, my superintendent put me in charge of all rigging. I wasn't the fastest rigger, but I was safety focused and insisted on doing it right every time, even if it took a little longer. This meant that my superintendent didn't have to watch over every rigging task and could go relax because I had it under control. Another millwright joined the crew about the same time I did. We'll call him Larry. We didn't get along at first, but after a few months, we became friends. Larry was the act now, think later type. Much like the superintendent I travel under, Larry was prone to making mistakes because of that attitude, but he was very fast and worked like a mule at all times, and I respected that. He wasn't especially skilled in any one area, so he had no special position. That meant sometimes he'd get put on less glamorous work, and I soon learned he was very jealous of my position as the rigger. At times, he would make comments like, "I'm going to take your job," not in getting me fired, but bumping me down a rung and him taking my spot as rigger. He'd come up behind me while I was looking over my checklists to point out something I may not have checked yet. If supervision was near, he'd make sure he was heard. At this point, I should mention this. I stick out like a sore thumb on this crew. I was raised in a very strict Christian cult, but in my mid-20s, I realized what was going on and left, at great cost, losing my family and friends because of strict shunning rules the cult practices. Some of the stricter things stuck with me. Like I've never been intoxicated. I don't use tobacco. No recreational drugs. I speak professionally, without slang or colloquialisms for the most part. These traits stick out from a crew of men that travel the road and work in harsh environments away from home for months on end. But Larry, he fits right in. Larry quickly became the superintendent's puppy, bringing him gifts of his favorite alcohol, staying out late after work with him, even rooming with him on the road. I, on the other hand, leave work, hit the gym, cook my food for the next day, and make sure I get at least 6 hours of sleep so I can perform the next day. I realize that puts me at a disadvantage socially in the workplace, but I prefer to let my work speak for itself. Anyways, fast forward about 18 months. We're starting a project just before COVID hits. About 2 weeks into the job, I have to attend a mandatory class through my union. It's a 40-hour class and in a different state, so I'll be gone for pretty much an entire week with travel time. I get permission from supervision and leave, with Larry rigging in my absence. A few days later, I'm lying in bed stressing out about the final test I have to take the next morning. If the test isn't passed, the entire week is wasted. I always psych myself out before a test, but in reality, I don't have anything to worry about as I'm a good student and test well. My phone goes off. It's a text from Larry. "I love you, bud, but I'm cutting your throat." I reply, "What are you talking about?" "When you get back, I'll be the rigger. You can do the shit work from now on." I'm not proud of the response I came back with, but it's how I truly felt in the moment. Be careful about cutting the throat of someone smarter than you. I'm far from the smartest person you'll ever meet, but I do enjoy reading, studying, and learning. And being smarter than Larry wasn't an accomplishment by any stretch of the imagination. The next morning, I passed the test and headed back to the job, where Larry had in fact usurped my position as rigger and was lording it over me as I went about doing the tasks he normally would do. To be completely honest, it was kind of like a vacation at first. Get paid nearly $40 an hour to clean parts or torque flanges with no stress? Sign me up. But I was upset. I was upset because I knew I did my job better than he would. I knew that he got along better with the superintendent because of their similar personalities, but I didn't feel that I should lose my position simply because Larry had more in common with our superintendent than I did. Regardless of that, I was now dealt these cards, and I had to play them. Just 3 days after I got back from class, though, the job was shut down. COVID-19 was just now sweeping the country. Out of an abundance of caution, the plant shut the project down until further notice. We were sent home for about 3 days and then called out to an emergency shutdown where a turbine had crashed. We roll out and are on the job 48 hours later, in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. We get right to work. On this particular unit, you pull the entire roof off in 2 sections with a crane to open the enclosure. Compared to many things we lift in a project like this, the roof weighs very little. The turbine rotor may weigh over 100,000 lbs, but the roof usually weighs around 7,000 lbs. Lightweight. But it is large and there are critical parts around the roof that can be damaged if not lifted carefully. Typical procedure is to be on top of the roof after it's unbolted, be in a full body harness, and tied off to an approved anchor point capable of holding at least 5,000 lbs per OSHA regulations. We then slowly take the weight of the roof with the crane until it's floating and then climb down off of it and continue the lift until it's set on the ground or on a truck to be moved. The superintendent instructs me to go on the roof with Larry and assist him. Do whatever Larry tells you to do. Okay, boss. I put on my harness and climb to the top and begin to assess the situation. The rigging to lift the roof is 4 to 5 ton chain falls. It's capable of safely holding 20 tons. Well over the weight of the roof. The crane is also well overrated for this lift, even with the boom extended all the way out in order to clear another building on the way to the ground. Larry has it all rigged up, but no tension on the wire rope slings. And then I notice his crucial mistake. He has forgot to account for boom deflection. When a crane takes the weight of a load, the boom flexes down. Depending on the crane setup and the weight of the load, it can mean that while your crane hook might be centered in your load with no weight on the hook, once you get the weight of the load on the crane hook could be anywhere from a few inches to a number of feet off center, which means that when the load comes off the ground, it swings. Swinging is bad. Always. Enough weight swinging could tip the crane, crash into equipment, crash into a person. It's very dangerous. At this point, I start calculating, is this weight enough, even swinging, to tip this crane? No, not even close. Is it enough to break a chain fall? No, not even close. Are there any people working around us that could get hurt? Nope, it's just us. Is there any equipment that could be damaged if it swings? Yes. An electrical control panel, which has all power killed to it and has been disconnected, is in the swing path. I decide to let Larry hang himself. He looks at me and asks what I think. I tell him, "This is your show, boss." He asks what I mean. I look him in the eye and draw my finger across my throat. He gets nervous because he knows exactly what I mean. Starts double-checking everything. He still doesn't notice the boom deflection. After a couple minutes, he decides I must be talking out of my ass and proceeds with the lift. I stop him and remind him to tie off with his harness. He doesn't realize it, but we're about to go for a ride. Generally, when I'm rigging, I first find out what the thing I'm rigging to weighs. It's a vital piece of information. If I know what it weighs, I can have the crane operator track how much weight he has on the crane, and I'll be able to know when the object should start to pick up. If we get to over 10% more than the object should weigh, there may be something stopping it from moving, and we need to stop and reassess the situation. Rigging could fail, the object you're lifting could jump into the sky. All kinds of mayhem may ensue if a hidden bolt holding something together breaks because you used too much force to lift it. I ask Larry if he knows how much the roof weighs. He doesn't. I do, but don't tell him. He starts signaling the crane to slowly hoist up. The operator complies and starts lifting. I'm watching the boom get pulled more and more off-center. We're probably 2 feet from the center of the load at this point, meaning a swing that could travel nearly 4 feet. I stop Larry and ask him to see how much weight is on the crane. $11,000, 4,000 more than what it should weigh. This roof is in a bind because we're not picking it straight up, but at an angle. It's either not going to move, or we're about to fly. I brace myself. "Hoist up, slowly," Larry calls over the radio. Boom! The whole roof shoots a good 2 feet into the air and swings wildly towards the control panel. Larry and I are riding it like pirates in the crow's nest in a hurricane. We crash into the control panel, bending it over at a 45-degree angle, destroying most of its components. People start pouring out of the nearby trailers to see what the commotion is all about. The crane operator is yelling over the radio, asking what the hell just happened. I'm smiling. Larry is shaking. He sees me smiling and knows that I knew. We get the roof set on the ground and are met by our superintendent. He's chewing Larry's ass hard. He gets to me and asks why I let it happen. I just say, I just did what Larry told me to do. The superintendent is no dummy. He's seen a thing or two and knows exactly what went down. Larry is demoted and I'm reinstalled as rigger immediately. And a few shifts later, it's all smoothed over. Larry and I are actually good friends now. We've been through a lot together and have each other's backs these days. He's now the foreman on our crew and lets me do my thing. Failing your way to the top is still a valid way of progressing in my field. But I'm happy for him. He's actually good at it. And I guess that's all there is to say about that. The revenge was really impactful and incurred benefits to the OP. A small mistake of Larry led to a dangerous swing of the crane, which ultimately cost him his position, and OP was reinstated as rigger. It was really a satisfying revenge. Bye-bye now. See you tomorrow.